Good afternoon, Chairman, Supervisors. My name is Chris Wanamaker, County Engineer. I also have with me today Joshua Plum. He's an Assistant County Engineer, and he manages the day-to-day operations of flood control. So today I'd like to talk to you about the overview of the Flood Control District, what we do, what we don't do, and some of the kind of ins and outs of things. And I understand probably between you guys and lunch, so I'm going to try to go fairly quickly, but feel free to interject with questions at any time. So the countywide flood control district was formed under Arizona Revised Statute 48-3602, and we have a series of 3 ordinances that we use to do what we do. So we have our floodplain management ordinance, which was adopted in 2019, and we also administer our drainage ordinance, which is quite old actually, from 1998, and our stormwater ordinance. And believe it or not, all 3 of those are completely different things, even though they have, they're water related. So here on the screen is our district mission statement. This is something that staff and leadership put together about 15 years ago, and I believe it really encompasses what we are trying to do as a district and what we're mandated to do. And really it comes down to protecting life and property from flooding through regulating development and projects. And we also do outreach and help with response as well by supporting emergency management. So our district funding currently is about $4.6 million. It is a secondary property tax at a rate of 16.93 cents per $100 of assessed value. It's countywide, obviously excluding state lands, excluding federal, no tribal, and whatnot. We also get funding from various sources through grant programs, whether it's Army Corps of Engineers, Federal Emergency Management Agency, National Resources Conservation Service. And then we get a little bit of revenue from our permit and review fees, which are actually fairly small. So at the previous board session, our Angeline Woods did talk a little bit about the tax rate. So you probably saw this slide before, and you can see for Pinal County, we're right there just left of the middle, or less than average as far as the rate goes. And I think it's been that way for quite a while. And you can see quite the range in tax rates across the state. It's quite interesting. Are there any specific questions about this? Okay. All right, so one question that we were asked last time by Supervisor Miller was about grant funding. So we added this slide. So over the last 5 years, the district has received 8 grants valued at more than $6.7 million. That's federal or state dollars, not counting our dollars. So this chart here shows all the different projects where we've received that funding. But of perhaps particular importance is when we have grants, we also have strings attached to it. And sometimes getting a grant can be quite challenging. There's a local match. The project has to be eligible, has to meet some specific criteria, which can sometimes be challenging to accommodate. And then, of course, there's cost increases over time, and you could have a project that may be viable at a certain time when you apply for the grant, but then years later when you get the money, perhaps now things have changed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at a later slide.
I think Supervisor Miller wants to insert
Yes.
a question.
Just real quick, because I do want to make kind of a point. I think every one of these required some type of a matching fund. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And they can vary
It's
from 50% to 25% to whatever.
That is correct. So, for example, the Lower Santa Cruz River feasibility study, which is an Army Corps grant, was 50-50. So there was a $2.7 million investment from the Flood Control District Fund for that. But these 2 NRCS watershed plans was closer to about 90-10, so we had about 10%, at least at the time. Now, of course, there's been change orders and things that have happened since we initiated those projects, but they were initiated at about a 90-10.
And that's the point I want to try to make with these grants. They're not, very rarely are they 100%, and we're always having to come up with dollars to execute them.
That is correct. Thank you, Supervisor. So a little bit about construction costs. I won't read all the numbers here, but we gathered some data from various sources. And, there's been an obvious increase in construction costs over the last few years, both due to inflation and supply chain disruptions, challenges with getting materials. In fact, there was a period of time where you just could not get concrete unless you wanted to pay an exorbitant amount of money for it. So you had to wait. So it affects all infrastructure because pretty much everything we build has concrete in some capacity, as an example. And then there's, of course, the labor challenges. And if desired, we can provide the source information for this on this slide. But labor challenges is also another thing that has resulted in cost increases. So this slide shows 3 different projects, two of which I mentioned at a previous board meeting about cost increases. And so you can see, for example, with our Sunland Gin Road Bridge project, the original cost back in 2018 when we applied for our FEMA grant was $1.6 million. And then when we received our low bid a few months ago, it was $7.2 million. It was quite a shock to see that. Our El Camino Viejo Bridge replacement project, which is under construction right now, more than doubled in cost just in the short period of 2 years from the time we initiated that project to once we got that bid from the contractor. And then you can see there with Dirtwater Springs, which is another priority project for us. And so the current cost estimate is 5.9. We did put in the budget request that you'll see July 5th, $7 million, and that extra $1.1 million is just a pad to hopefully totally encompass the cost of that project. Now, by the way, that is a 50-50 cost share with the city of Apache Junction. Let's see here. So one thing I wanted to talk about is flood protection districts. And I don't know, some of you guys may be aware, there are actually 6 flood protection districts within our county. These are completely different than the countywide flood control district that we're talking about today. And these were created under a different state statute and typically for a specific purpose, to own, operate, and maintain a piece of infrastructure such as a dam or a levee or something like that. These types of flood protection districts can be dissolved and their assets can be turned over to the county. So on this slide, I got a map of the 6 flood protection districts across the county. So as an example, the red one there you see on the map, that is Magma Flood Control District. They call them Flood Control District, but again, it's a flood protection district. So they have this taxing area, which is shown in the red, and they use those funds to manage the Magma Dam. Some of these districts are more active than others. And so any resident that lives in one of these areas, on their tax bill, they're going to see a flood control district tax for Pinal County, and then they'll also see another tax for these districts. Now, we work with these districts sometimes on joint projects or studies. And like I said, some are more active than others. As an example, the one in yellow, that's the Maricopa Flood District, not to be confused with the Maricopa County Flood Control District, completely different. There's been some discussions with them about dissolving that district because I guess there's been some concerns about, hey, why am I being, quote, double taxed, if that's the way you want to look at it. But they have infrastructure there within the city that district maintains. So there's been some discussions about dissolving that now. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question just real quick on that?
Yeah, Supervisor Miller?
Yeah, thank you. Because this is the Santa Cruz area that kind of impacts all of those in that line. That's the path of that Santa Cruz. And how does that interact with these districts?
Yeah, that's correct. So and that's a great observation there. The Santa Cruz River runs right there through 4 of these districts. And so the infrastructure, say, there in the green, that's the Green Reservoir Flood Control District. They have a system of channels and levees that help to divert and control those flows from the Santa Cruz River. Now, as far as I know, that district, the funding that they get is very small, and so they basically do vegetation control. And so we are working with that district as an example on the Sunlingen Road project that I referenced earlier, because what we're trying to do with that infrastructure impacts them and some properties they own that they'll work with us to get that infrastructure built.
And you might get to some of this, and I'll just touch base on it, though. I hope that there's opportunity at some point that we might be able to use some of this as recharge programs as water comes down through them. And then I think maybe like you take the city of Maricopa, because of all the development that's been there, maybe they're mitigating some of their issues by the subdivisions being built. I don't know. I'm just kind of curious.
Chairman, Supervisor Miller, yeah, there's plenty of opportunity for that, and I'll go back to the Green Reservoir Flood District. They have some properties out there that we were looking at as a potential for a recharge facility that would also have a flood control function, and we'd done as part of our Greenwash watershed plan, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. We've done some preliminary work on exploring just that with those properties. And so we want to see if there is that opportunity to have a federal investment in something like that as well, because these are large, expensive projects. So, but it's definitely being looked at.
We can talk about that later.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a little bit about district programs. So floodplain management. Floodplain management is what we do every day. It's regulating development, issuing floodplain use permits. A floodplain use permit is intended to ensure that any development is reasonably safe from flooding, and that's the term they use, and that it will not cause an adverse impact to adjacent properties. We regulate development within the federally mapped floodplains, or we call them FEMA floodplains, and we also have local floodplains that we've mapped ourselves using engineering methods and studies. Should be important to note here that we also do permitting, floodplain permitting, for many of the communities, municipalities within the county. This is mostly the smaller ones like Eloy and Coolidge. We don't do permits for Casa Grande, Apache Junction, Florence, or Kearney. And actually, Maricopa last night at their council meeting, I don't know if they passed. I don't know if you heard. But they were considering passing their own floodplain ordinance. And if it did pass, it would be effective in 30 days, and they would effectively take over their own permitting. So I have yet to hear if that's passed or not, but let's see here. So a little bit more about permit review. Like I mentioned, we pretty much anything that is done in a floodplain, there's a review that goes on. Now, the good thing is, perhaps, let's see, let's skip ahead here. If there are no floodplain issues, then they're just given a clearance and they're on their way. The majority of the permits and stuff that we review do result in a clearance, and I do have more information on that at the next slide here. One of the big things we do is with subdivision reviews, if there's a floodplain involved, they have to go through a two-step process where they submit what's called a conditional letter of map revision, which is basically a proposal to revise the floodplain. Then it goes through review, goes to FEMA review at the federal level. Then they construct the improvements, and then they come back with an actual letter of map revision. One important thing to note here is when it comes to flood control solutions, our floodplain ordinance does state that any above grade flood control structures, such as levees, dams, berms, what have you, do require prior approval from the board before they can go down that road. And we'll talk more about that later too. Here I've got a couple of graphs, charts here showing our reviews over the years. So on the left here, drainage report reviews. In orange is for subdivisions, and you can see how in 2010 we had only a handful, and then we went up over 160 in 2021, and we're down to just over 100 last year. That's quite a few still. It's one every 3 to 4 days over the course of the year. The blue ones there on the left side, that's for non-residential. So we're talking commercial, industrial, and other types of things. On the right, permit reviews. So last year we did about 4,200 permit reviews. 90% of those had no floodplain issues, so they were just issued a clearance. They're on their way. About 10% resulted in further review and then issuance of a actual floodplain use permit with specific requirements for that development. One thing that's important to note too is that Pinal County is part of the community rating system, which is a system that the federal government has to recognize floodplain management programs that go above and beyond the federal minimum. And we actually became a member in 2015, and we're currently at a Class 6 rating, which I think is really good. And that results in a 20% discount on flood insurance for anybody in the unincorporated county who has insurance. So those residents are benefiting from our floodplain management program and paying 20% less on their flood insurance.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a question real quick?
Yeah, this is the work session, so feel free to ask questions.
Mr. Wanamaker, can you back up one slide real quick?
Yes.
So floodplain clearance permit issuance, what is required to get a permit in a floodplain? Because you say it gets additional review and then you give them a permit, but what do you have to do to the building?
Chairman, Supervisor McClure, great question. So typically, let's say we're talking about a house, for example, they're going to have to provide a plan to show that they're going to elevate the house above the floodplain elevation. We'll help them by providing them what that floodplain elevation is, whether it's a few inches above the ground or perhaps a few feet. They'll have to hire a surveyor to prepare what's called an elevation certificate, to submit that document to us. And if they can demonstrate with their plans that they will be elevated properly and they've got all the correct documentation, then at that point we can issue a permit. And then afterwards they'll have to return what we call a final elevation certificate, which is basically an as-built certification that they've elevated that home to the right elevation.
And so that brings me to my next piece, like Arizona City, where that 1 square mile is in the floodplain, and I think it was purple back there, where we've got homes that are 3 feet higher than their neighbors, and that creates issues for those people that get stuck between two homes like that. And so is there some piece of that in that permit that says, your drainage can't go sideways under the neighbor's yard, it has to drain out to the street, and ideally it drains away when it hits the street. It doesn't always happen, but there's some provision in there for that.
Supervisor McClure, that's a great question. So what the floodplain ordinance really is concerned about the elevation of the building and the protection of that new building. It doesn't necessarily get down to the details of on-lot drainage. That kind of does fall under the drainage ordinance criteria. So that's going to be one of the challenges I'm going to talk about later, that our drainage ordinance is very old. It's from 1998, and actually there's a lot of exemptions that we're working to close the loop on with the new drainage ordinance at some point in the future. So it doesn't get that detailed into the site drainage, like from the roof runoff.
The site plan, but that comes in play someplace.
With drainage ordinance.
Downstream, sure.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so going back to CRS here. So we're currently at Class 6 rating, which again is very good. Okay, capital projects. So we do a lot of projects. So since 2008, we've invested more than $11 million, and actually that number is probably low because it doesn't count the projects we finished last year. And that's actual just construction dollars in the ground infrastructure that directly benefits residents and property owners. As was mentioned at a previous board meeting, we have 40 flood control projects in our 5-year plan with a value or cost estimate of $36 million. And then we also have 11 bridge projects, which is actually a different funding source, but there's $3.4 million planned for bridge expenditures in our 5-year plan. And then beyond the 5-year time horizon, we do have 19 additional projects at $82 million, and it's quite high there, but quite a few projects.
At collecting $4 million a year.
Well,
we're a little short.
Supervisor. Yeah, that's a great point, and that's why our 5-year plan does go well beyond, the list of projects goes well beyond 5 years, and it is a challenge, and that's why we've got to work towards whatever grant funding we can get. And you saw on that chart there, we have received funding from various agencies over the years, and we continue to do that. And there's actually a new grant program that I was just made aware of that the Army Corps of Engineers has that we're right now exploring to see if any of our existing projects would be eligible under that, because that's really the only way we're going to be able to get a lot of these things done. These are big projects.
I don't want to go back to the slide, but I noticed when they looked at the rate on the flood in all the different counties, I mean, there were some that were 2-3 times what our rate is. I mean, is that just the policy of that county, or is it lack of private? I mean, we can only tax private land, and that's about 20% plus or minus of Pinal County, but we have to control the flooding of the entire county. So it's almost impossible to really get a handle on it or really be proactive. I mean, we're totally reactive.
Yeah, thank you, Supervisor. Yeah, it is definitely a challenge, and I do have some in the later slides talking more about challenges with project costs. It is, yeah, and I think Santa Cruz County has the highest tax rate that I'm aware of, but they're a small county, and they've got some big challenges with the Santa Cruz River as it comes across the border from Mexico, and so they spend quite a bit of money dealing with that type of thing. And so with being a small county, they're going to have to have a higher rate to be able to bring in enough money to make a difference. So here's just a map showing kind of all the projects we have in our 5-year plan. I think it's important to note here that it's spread across the whole county. We want to try to cover all 5 districts, and we want to try to do projects within the municipalities as well, because that helps us capitalize on partnership opportunities where we can get more done with at least less of our money from our direct revenue. So those partnership opportunities is always a good way to improve efficiency. And also, again, the secondary property tax does cover those city boundaries. So a city resident will be paying a flood tax to the county. So we try really hard to spread these projects out across the whole county. Okay, studies. In addition to construction projects, we do a lot of studies too. And almost every construction project begins with some kind of study. So we've got drainage master plans that we're working on, water course master plans, and then watershed plans. And I know they sound very similar, but there are little differences. We meet different criteria depending on what we're trying to do or what program. In this case, like watershed plans for NRCS, we have to meet their criteria in order for the resulting projects that come out of these plans to be eligible for federal money. So this map kind of shows the scale of these studies that we're working on. So the McClellan Wash Watercourse Master Plan, for example, that's a very large plan. The 2 plans shown in yellow, those are proposed for future. We have not done anything to initiate those at this time. It's just something that at some point we'd like to address because they are tributaries to the lower Santa Cruz River, which is just an area where we have a lot of flooding challenges.
Chris, if I may?
Yes.
And we can't get a grant unless we have one of these studies done. Is that a pretty true statement?
Supervisor, yes, and yeah, exactly. It's in order to get the grant funding to construct something, we have to have a study to support that.
Demonstrating that.
So these studies, as an example, they'll go through a process of evaluating project alternatives. So you have a bunch of project ideas based on the hydrology and the hydraulics of the situation, where your flooding issues are, and then those projects will be evaluated and narrowed down to essentially a preferred alternative or a preferred series of projects that essentially work together. But you have to go through this study process in order to demonstrate to the federal government that you've have a project that is the best project that you can do to solve that problem. So. Another program that we have is our alert system, which is our rain gauges or precipitation stream gauges across the county. So we have 47 of those across the county and 18 webcams, which webcams are something that we've recently done over the last few years. And the big thing with this program is it directly supports the National Weather Service forecasting operations. And so many of our stream gauges are tied directly into their system, and we collaborate with Weather Service people on getting those emergency notifications and forecasting, getting it tied to real data, real things that are happening on the ground, so we can have accurate warnings. We do have a 5-year plan for this program, and we're going to be updating it this coming calendar year, and that plan helps kind of direct where the next stream gauges are going to go, equipment upgrades, and various other things related to the program. So this map shows in the red dots are all the 47 stream and rain gauges across the county. We've tried to spread it out, get a good, dense network as much as we can. And then those webcams, again, also spread out. And you can see here on this slide, on the right is an example image from the webcam at McClellan Wash. So in one image, obviously, it's dry. In the other, it's the same location, same direction, but during flooding conditions. And so this helps give us basically live information about what's actually happening out there. We're not necessarily having to rely on a number or data showing up. And this is all public. This is all available on the county website. People can go on there and look at the data, look at the images. I believe these cameras update every hour. But we're able to adjust that, I believe, in specific situations if needed. So, okay, let's see here. And of course, when we build infrastructure, that also means we're going to have to maintain them. So, as of right now, we have 7 detention basins across the county, 10 channels at 5.6 miles in length, 3 dams, which we actually recently decommissioned, and that project's wrapping up right now. And then there's 1 levee that we have an inspection responsibility for, but we don't actually own it. Investigations and enforcement is another thing that we do. This map just shows more than 800 complaints that we've received since 2003. So when we get complaints, we typically go out, do an investigation, determine, is it a floodplain ordinance violation? Is it drainage ordinance? And then we try to get compliance. And we try to work with that property owner, get them through the permit process, and get it done correctly to address that problem. In a few cases, we've had to go in and actually remediate it ourselves and then charge the property owner. So we have that ability as well. So stormwater. So the stormwater program is to ensure compliance with ADQ and EPA stormwater regulations, also to help ensure that land developers obtain the necessary stormwater permits and that they adhere to their approved plans when they're doing construction activities. And then we also do education, outreach, and training as part of this program. Okay, land subsidence and earth fissures. This is another thing that we get involved with. So we partner with the ADWR on what they call the INSAR program, which is a program that uses satellites to measure ground movement. And I'll show an image of that in a moment. And, it's really interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think there's a correlation between that and flood control, but if we have lowering of the ground surface, that does change flood patterns. And there's plenty of evidence of that across the state. So it's actually pretty important to what we do. We also work with the Arizona Geological Survey on earth fissures, which are cracks that form in the ground due to groundwater withdrawal, and that does affect development as where you can put your house, or it may affect your subdivision layout, as an example. So we work with the Geological Survey on that. So this slide shows a couple images. So on the left is an image we might get from the satellite data that shows us land subsidence. And so this is near, south of Apache Junction, actually. south of the industrial area. There in the middle is physical evidence of land subsidence. You can see that the well foundation there is floating above the ground. That's because the ground is lowered. And then on the right, of course, is the earth fissure, and we want to make sure that people aren't putting their houses on top of these things. So that's part of what we do. Okay, bridge inspection and management program. So another thing we do is we manage all the bridges in the county, mostly because most bridges are over water, and most bridges that have problems due to hydraulic processes or processes related to water, such as erosion, scour, flooding, and whatnot. There's currently 155 bridges, I believe, across the county. And we work, these bridges are inspected by ADOT on our behalf so that we leverage their expertise, and then we go through and do projects to address any issues with these bridges.
Is a bridge the same as a culvert, or culverts all bridges?
Supervisor, great question. So the definition of a bridge is any structure that has a 20-foot span. So it could very well be a multi-barrel culvert, which some of those are.
Okay.
So, yes. All right. Challenges. This goes back to your earlier question, Supervisor Miller. Funding infrastructure is a challenge. A single local project that has any appreciable benefit could easily cost $2 million. So that basically means we can do 1 to 2 projects a year on our current revenue. That's without federal investment. However, we try to look at the possibility of doing regional scale projects or larger, more community type projects. And those, of course, with cost goes up, typically in the $5 to $10 million range. But you get more, more cost benefit. You can have bigger bang for the buck, I guess. And then, as I mentioned earlier, grant programs are very competitive, limited in scope, and often have stringent criteria. I mentioned the 5-year plan here. And also, I guess I should clarify that the 5-year plan and these 19 projects beyond that do not even include the projects that were listed in the McClellan-Wash Watercourse Master Plan, which is a whole separate thing that we may come to the board with the presentation on that in the future. Okay, another challenge we have, and this goes back to Supervisor McClure's question, is single lot development. So most of the flooding and drainage problems that we have and complaints are related to single lot residential development. And these are residential developments that are not within subdivisions, not within master plan communities or anything like that. So there's current exemptions in the current drainage ordinance on these types of development. So it does make it really challenging to enforce or deal with certain issues. Now, we've tried to implement as many things as possible to try and address this, but really a new drainage ordinance is what we need to do. And that's something we are working on and have been for quite some time. And that'll also be coming to this board at some point in the future when it's ready. Another challenge we have is the accuracy of floodplain maps. Everyone wants to argue about the maps being wrong, and honestly, they may be right. Some of these maps are more than 40 years old, and they use 1970s technology and methods. And so, you could be out there and say, hey, this has never flooded. There's no evidence of it. And yet you might have it on the map that way. Doing a mapping study is quite expensive. And years ago, we used to do quite a few of them. But we've kind of moved away from that because of the costs and because we have other tools now to regulate flooding or development and address flooding that don't necessarily require us to go through a extensive, expensive mapping process. And also, when we talk about these maps, these are the FEMA maps, the federal government maps. So they should be doing that. Let's see here. Another challenge is, kind of mentioned this earlier, levees and dams are above grade structures. An important thing to note here is the Arizona County's insurance pool, which is our insurance provider, they will not insure, they've told us, any new above grade flood control structures. So if the county were to approve one or construct one, we would have no insurance protection for that. So we would have to address that through another carrier or some other policy. The challenge with these types of structures is there's high residual risk, and when a dam fails or a levee fails, it usually makes the news. As an example, in 2021, here in this county, there were 5 berm breaches or levee breaches. These were private structures, not owned by any agency. These were farmers' structures or perhaps structures that had been there for decades that failed during the 2021 monsoon. And when they fail, it's usually catastrophic. A flood wave comes down and it creates a lot more damage than if the structure had never been there in the first place. So we've done a lot at our level, at the staff level, and with our plans and our policies and the things that we have in place to help curb this type of approach to flood control. So the good news is we don't really see a lot of development coming in proposing this kind of stuff anymore because of how challenging it would be to do it. So that's all I have. If there's any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any fishing reports for the Santa Cruz River?
I haven't heard any.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay.
All right.
I think that's it then. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.